He said at the press conference the night before, they look forward to the race of the century.
Feels like going into it, it was a complete David versus Goliath contest.
Yes. So when your back's to the wall, okay, and you're in the trenches, the question is, the people around you, are we all together? The Americans are highly competitive people. They will eat their grandmother if required.
The boat which looks fastest at the beginning of the competition isn't always the one that goes on to win it at the end.
Not at all. The Confederation of Australian Sport voted the Australia 2 victory as the greatest team performance in the last 200 years of Australian sport.
Wow.
The fastest boat comes from people making decisions. They'll look back on it with their kids and grandkids with great pride, because this is an opportunity of a lifetime.
So John, when we talk about a moment in time, and I think what this would be for Ben if he was to actually win this America's Cup, you've already been there, done that, and got the T-shirt with Australia too. And you skippered that team, against the odds to that victory. I think it was 132 years or something of American dominance that you ripped away from them. And I think let's start, if we can, with that final race, because it was 3-3, so finely poised going into that final day. What does it feel like as the skipper of a team who is holding in the palm of his hands that opportunity?
Well, put it in context that the America's Cup started before the US Civil War. So here we were 3-3. Dennis Conner, the skipper of the US boat, he said at the press conference the night before, they look forward to the race of the century. Okay, which is true, as it turns out. And the racing in that era, we're talking about a long time ago, way back in 1983, the races were typically 4 hours long, not 20 minutes. So it's a different world. And how did I feel? Well, Raz was just fantastic.
This is your wife?
Yes, she'd been there. She'd seen it all. All the losing. That was my fourth America's Cup push. These things don't come easy, clearly. Well, it's very, very difficult. But there's a great sort of scenario of racing to calmness. And since then, I've just retired as president of Swimming Australia, the Olympic program, which has been super successful, big turnaround. And we work very closely with the Special Forces. Your parallel there is the SBS people. In our world, it's SAS. And they talk about that a lot, racing to calmness. And exactly when I reflect back, that was how I felt. Waking up in the morning, helicopters overhead. You couldn't even communicate more than a metre in front. This is at the dock. So the game changed dramatically. There were helicopters 1,000 feet in the air. And then above that, fixed-wing aircraft before we left the dock, US Coast Guard with their horns, boom, boom, boom. Anyway, and the Americans do it in a big manner, keeping everyone at bay. It's like it's another world. And then, the race, we actually had some postponements leading into that, so it was delayed. And as it turns out, the race, the lead changed 7 times. The US boat package was highly competitive, as we were, and it got down to tactics and wind shifts and here I am now.
Was there a moment during that campaign where, I'm going to say the wind shifted, which feels like a real pun given the context of the conversation we're having, but was there a moment where the sort of things changed, the dial shifted slightly in your favour? Because it feels like going into it, it was a complete David versus Goliath contest, but it felt like over time it started to change, the narrative shifted.
Yes, we're about halfway through the regatta. From my perspective, I could detect a change in the tactics of Dennis and Tom Whidden and the afterguard of the US boat, Liberty, in terms of being more defensive compared to maybe backing their judgment as much. So there's a change, and it's just sort of like a little bit of a flick, you might say. And certainly in the final race, it was highly competitive, but that so-called fifth leg that is part of our country's history. You'll like this. The Confederation of Australian Sport voted the Australia 2 victory as the greatest team performance in the last 200 years of Australian sport.
Wow. And there's a lot of team performances in the
Yeah,
history
you know,
of
we're talking
Australian
about
sport.
Sir Donald Bradman, that era, and all of that stuff. So we're very proud of that, clearly. There was an X factor associated with it. But that final second last leg where we came from behind, a long way back, we sailed the boat according to our computer printouts, which we discovered in the museum 20 years later, because we never did a debrief. We won, who cares, you know. And we sailed the boat as close to perfection as we'd ever sailed for the whole summer. So we're on song, we're in our flow, as we call it. And in addition to that, the US team decided to so-called jibe away from us, seeking better air. They were going for more of a high-risk strategy, as it turns out. We came around the top mark, literally 1,000 boats at the top mark, wind going over these big destroyers, US Coast Guard boats and so on. You couldn't see the wind on the water. It was like a washing machine. We actually came around with more wind than our counterpart, who are further down the track. And they jibed away. In hindsight, probably they didn't need to do that. They talk about covering. God, I don't want to get into covering. Every Australian citizen talks about covering before we won. And we got back in the race. You know, we got back in. So, you know, one of those twists and turns. The reality is, Georgie, that looking back, we made less mistakes than our counterpart when it really counted on the world stage. Now, it's a big statement to make, but it's a reality. The boats were pretty much identically matched, except downwind. We had little spinnakers. We created that during our selection trials as a result of being beaten badly by the Italians. So at the beginning of the season, summer over in Newport, there's no way we could have won the America's Cup, but the development curve, like any of these projects now, it's a continual development, and we eventually had a package which was world class in that era. And of course, life's moved on.
But isn't that such an important point that you make about the process of a cup campaign and how it evolves, that the boat which looks fastest at the beginning of the competition isn't always the one that goes on to win it at the end?
No, not at all. No, we had great vulnerabilities with the spinnakers, and that was the era that as it turns out, got us back in the race with Dennis and his team. So that was an evolution during the summer. You know, we were in real trouble downwind. There's no way we could get around the track and not beat, in some cases, a conventional boat. We knew that when we were training way back in Australia against a conventional boat called Challenge 12. We didn't know at one stage which boat we should take to America. So yeah, and that comes back to the psyche of the team. You know, the quality of the people, the values and the culture in the organisation, learning from it, moving on, and building. And the question is, hopefully going 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because there will be changes and backwards. But the question is, what are the key decisions to be made to be able to actually go 2 steps forward and not go backwards when everyone is trying so hard? There's not an issue of motivation. You know, people literally die for these crazy events. The question is, how do we get a group of people working together? And I talk about it a lot, and this is the case with our project. 1 + 1 = 3. How do we get a group of people working such that with the egos parked at the door, getting these key decisions, whether it's technical or sailing ability, together, such that you really start to create magic. And that's possible with a group of people if, in fact, the values within the organisation are solid. And let me say, we would, in hindsight, we could have never won the America's Cup, because I was involved with 3 losing efforts. We would never have won until we got the culture right, which was all about trust. And trust is simple, but it's easy. It's hard word. It's an easy word to say. It's hard to do. But trust comes from respect for each other, empathy, being clear, communication, being honest, integrity. That comes from the top down as well as within the organisation. So when your back's to the wall, okay, and you're in the trenches, the question is, the people around you, are we all together? That's a big statement.
Yeah, it's also a huge truism. You also, though, having had 3 campaigns which didn't end in victory, took yourself off to America to really go and understand what it was behind the scenes that was giving them the advantage. Just tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's extraordinary.
Yes.
Hello, performance people, listeners. My name is Freddie Carr, and I host a podcast called the Inside Tack, which is a podcast that follows the British America's Cup team, Ineos Britannia, as we get ready for the 37th America's Cup down here in Barcelona. We also follow the youth and the first ever Women's America's Cup. We would love you to like and subscribe to our podcast. Follow us on all your social media channels as we get ready for our sporting challenge of a lifetime.
Well, the Americans, yes, I graduated with a Master of Science from MIT in Boston, considered one of the best, if not the best, technical engineering schools in the world. And Raza was with me, of course, and I had a scholarship that got me there, which was fantastic. The Americans are highly competitive people. They will eat their grandmother if required. That's how competitive these people are. It's the reality. It's who makes the most dollars. We don't have kings and they don't have kings and queens. It's a matter of the multi-billionaires, unless you're a Kennedy family, okay, and Jackie and JFK and so on. And we spent some time with the Kennedy family, so it was another world. That was their royal family. But putting that aside, highly competitive. Okay, and that's America. That's who we are. And they're not in the business of losing. So the New York Yacht Club, when it became obvious that this Australian effort with the boxing kangaroo, when we studied armies over the last 1,000 years, typically as us human beings, we go to war with symbols, flags and music. So we create our own battle flag, which is now the very famous boxing kangaroo flag. The boxing kangaroo flag is the official flag of the Australian Olympic team across all sports. Red gloves for aggression, pumped up chest for the pride of the nation, taking on the world. You look at the stance of our flag. Okay, we're proud of that, and we created that. And our theme song was "Men at Work Down Under," which just epitomised what the country, Vegemite sandwich and all that stuff. Okay. We bought the biggest loudspeakers we could in Newport, put them on our tiny little tender called Black Swan, compared to the tenders, that's available now. And when we left the dock, all of Newport understood that we were going off to battle. And the self-image of this organisation was such that we figured that we actually were in there with a shot, okay? Previous efforts I've been involved with, there's no way. It was like, lambs to the slaughter. And so the psyche of the organisation were there in the business of winning, which had never been done before. So it was, new territories. But the question is, how do we get out of bed in the morning? Do we see ourselves as world champions or not? What's required to get to a program that could be the case in 20 years' time? Let's get there faster than anyone else in the world. So the vision was over the horizon. And the value proposition was around this thing called trust.
One of your greatest assets is, of course, your wife, who's phenomenal and always by your side and, always got that sort of, really straight talking Australian direct approach as to, what you need to be told and when, and can sort of really help you, I suspect, navigate those tricky moments. I mean, how important was it also? You talk about you got to leave the ego at the front door, but you need a little bit of ego as well, right, to be able to actually do what you ended up doing.
No question.
So how did sort of that? How did she just manage to navigate keeping you in check in the right moments?
Raza and the kids, we've all grown up. So outside of this booth that we're broadcasting now, we have Raza. 54 years we've been married. That's a world record. No one will ever achieve that, particularly in the world of America's Cup. And then we've got our daughter and two little rugrats, and the rugrats don't care about pops. They just, as long as we're around, it's beautiful stuff. So in that era, Lucas was 10, and then we had Andre was 6 and Sunshine was 4. And they, as long as, there was love in the family then, but she was great. She was the glue and still is. She was the family glue. And she calls a spade, and she tells the reporters when to rack off. John's busy or if he needs some rest. And, she was great. She was a traffic cop. And you've got to have those. And she'd been it all. She'd been through all the losses, lots of blood on the water in terms of this crazy thing called the America's Cup. And eventually, we got there.
And so when you look at what Ben's doing here with this team, and like you say, it's a whole world away from 1983, but there are obviously going to be similarities that you can pick up on what's going on in the boat shed, just sort of over my shoulder. But what is your sort of assessment of where the cup's at now? And again, still, is it as hard as ever to win it?
Yes. Well, the racing at the moment is rough. Okay, things are breaking, people are making mistakes. It'll get tighter and tighter as the event rolls on. So this is very, very early days. So, the reality is that the Americans blew their rudder off yesterday, and Ineos have had issues in terms of starting and whatever. That'll be sorted out. They'll be much smoother because the learning curves are almost vertical. Still, the question is by October, the learning curve, development curves will be almost flat, and then you'll have two projects coming together, and then hopefully it's the Ineos project, which is coming on to Team New Zealand, and then it'll get back invariably, even though we talk about the fastest boat wins, the fastest boat comes from people making decisions. You don't get a fast boat off the shelf. You don't go to Walmart's and buy a fast boat. It's the evolution of really smart people working collaboratively together, technical people. But in addition to that, it's Ben and his team coming off the water and giving world-class accurate feedback to the design engineers. And that's a people thing, it's a people interaction. So eventually the package that Ineos package will be in weeks to come will be much further advanced with the right type of communication. So as I said with Australia too, there's no way in hindsight we could have won the Cup with the package that initially we started off with in Newport all those years ago. But we had some really smart people working together collaboratively, including this crazy guy called Thomas Schnackenberg, who was a failed nuclear physicist, and this crazy guy called Ben Lexton.
He's a genius.
Well, in my opinion, he was the Leonardo da Vinci of Australia. He went to school at 9 and left at 12, presumably unteachable. He was an orphan. He was unrestricted with his thinking. Trying to work with him was impossible. And he was just out there with all the first day we put Australia 2 in the water, we did a 360. He said, "John, we've got to pull it out of the water. I need to change the stern." I said, "Ben, we haven't even sailed the damn thing yet." He said, No, we've got to change the stern," which we didn't, of course, That was Ben. He was always
But that comes back to your word of trust. You had to trust him that he knew where he was going with that thinking.
As much as we could.
Yeah.
But 8 out of the 10 ideas were crazy. But then and the wing keel came from Ben, for example, being empowered to explore beyond conventional thinking. And that was over the horizon.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, isn't it? You're not going to win the America's Cup with a safe design.
No.
Or a safe game plan.
Well, it's hard. It's hard to beat the defender. The defender makes the rules. New York Yacht Club made the rules, and they changed it. Ultimately we had to make our own sailcloth in Australia because it looked like that the Australian effort was getting closer. The software we're using, ultimately, so at one point they were saying that all the software had to be developed, including the code, in your own country. So Microsoft, for example, couldn't be used, or that era, okay?
Yeah.
So that was all the battle. So the same thing here, the Kiwis, okay, they're fine, but they're highly competitive. They've got the jump in terms of designs and so on, in terms of, the modifications into it, and it's a tough gig.
Could you have imagined, though, back in 1983, if you skip forward 30 odd years, can you have imagined the Cup would be where it is in terms of the development of these boats?
No way.
And where they're at?
So, in the same wind strength, we'd sail along at 15 kilometers an hour, and now they can do 100, okay? The designs have changed. But the thing I find exciting is what's the game going to look like in 20 years' time? The beautiful thing about human endeavour is that in 20 years' time, it'll make today look archaic. That's the exciting thing. And that's human endeavour. That's people working with people under the intensity of what you have here. The people, you guys, the team, the organisation's working 7x24. There's no such thing as a watch and a clock off time. It doesn't exist now. And as I say, in years to come, it'll just you look back and think, hey, that was pretty cool, but how much far better are we? Not only in speed of boats, but in organisation and the selection of people and the, monitoring the, everything, this whole psyche, this brain is hanging between our ears, still the most powerful supercomputer known to mankind. And the suggestion is we use 10% of it only. So in terms of the micro decision making that Ben and his team are making out on the water, that micro where you're basically trusting your instinctive feel, your intuition, which is still misunderstood, that will be much further progressed than what we are even today as we make this podcast. That's the exciting thing.
Yeah. So final question, final ask. And I know you've spoken already to the team, in front of the team. What would your override?
That was scary.
Yeah, was it? Was it intimidating?
What is
you love talking, you'd be fine with that. What is your overriding message to them as they embark on this, they call it a challenge of a lifetime, and it is for them?
Yeah, which it is, yeah. And I didn't say it, but I reckon, everyone should just write down in the old world with pen and paper their thoughts, because they'll look back on it with their kids and grandkids with great pride, because this is an opportunity of a lifetime. I think the key message that I hopefully left was the collaboration and the consideration that the end game is a long way off. And just reflect back on real stories, not theory, in real story, Australia 2 and our team and our total package would not have been able to win the America's Cup at the beginning of the campaign in Newport Roland compared to at the end in that final race, the race of the century, when we're 3-all down, 3-all each.
And let us all take that away and be grateful for it. John, thanks so much.
Great pleasure.
Join us for the Performance People podcast every week for the highs, lows, lessons and stories from people like this lot. Michael Johnson.
Some days what I would see is a person who is a shell of what I used to be.
Eddie Hearn.
We don't operate in a business that's dangerous, but we just operate in one where you've got to sleep with one eye open.
Mo Farah.
It couldn't get any harder than what I've gone through, and at that point I just went for it.
Paula Radcliffe.
You can only control yourself.
Susie Wolf.
And Toto did once liken me to a donkey.
Every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.